HOA, Karen locked my daughter in a frozen minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit shed. The reason was shocking. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a December night, so cold that even the stars seemed to shiver in the sky. Sarah Mitchell's phone buzzed against the hotel nightstand, pulling her from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Her husband, Tom, stirred beside her as she fumbled for the device, her heart already racing with that primal instinct every parent knows, the one that whispers something is terribly, terribly wrong. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The voice was professional but urgent. "This is Officer Chun with the Riverside Police Department. We're at your residence. Your daughter Emma is safe now, but she's being transported to St. Mary's Hospital with hypothermia. You need to get here as quickly as possible." The words didn't make sense. Emma was supposed to be at home with Mrs. Rodriguez, their trusted neighbor who'd watched her dozens of times before. They were only 2 hours away, attending Tom's company dinner, the first date night they'd managed in over a year. How could Emma have hypothermia? They lived in Minnesota, sure, but their house was warm, safe, equipped with every modern comfort a child could need. "I don't understand," Sarah heard herself saying, her voice small and far away. "What happened? How did she get outside?" There was a pause, heavy with something Sarah would later recognize as barely contained anger. "Ma'am, your daughter wasn't outside. She was locked in your backyard shed. A neighbor heard her crying and called us. We had to break the padlock to get her out." In that moment, Sarah Mitchell's world shattered into 1,000 frozen pieces. But she couldn't have imagined, not in her darkest nightmares, who had put that lock on the door or why. That truth would come later, and it would change everything. 3 months earlier, the Mitchell family had thought they'd found paradise. Riverside Meadows was everything they'd dreamed of when they left the cramped city apartment behind. The neighborhood sprawled across gently rolling hills, each home a testament to suburban achievement with its manicured lawn, 2-car garage, and HOA-approved paint scheme. Children played on sidewalks free from traffic. Parents waved to each other during morning jogs. It was the kind of place where you didn't just buy a house, you bought into a lifestyle, a community, a promise of the American dream realized. Sarah remembered the day they'd moved in, watching 8-year-old Emma run through their new backyard, her laughter echoing off the privacy fence they'd been so excited about. Tom had hoisted their daughter onto his shoulders, pointing out the swing set they'd install, the garden Sarah wanted to plant, the shed where they'd store all their tools and outdoor equipment. Everything felt possible. Everything felt safe. The HOA welcome packet had been impressive 43 pages of rules, regulations, and community standards. Sarah had skimmed it while unpacking boxes, noting the usual restrictions. No chain link fences, trash cans must be hidden from street view, lawn maintenance every 2 weeks, decorations required prior approval. Standard stuff for a neighborhood this nice. Tom had joked that at least they wouldn't have to live next to anyone flying a Confederate flag or painting their house purple. They'd met their immediate neighbors within the first week. The Johnsons to the left were friendly retirees who immediately offered to watch Emma if they ever needed help. The Patel family to the right had twin boys Emma's age who attended the same elementary school. Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow who lived 3 doors down, had brought over homemade tamales and become an instant grandmother figure to Emma. And then there was Karen Westfield. Karen lived in the largest house on the block, a sprawling colonial with columns that seemed almost comically oversized for the Midwest. She'd appeared on their doorstep the second Saturday after they'd moved in, clipboard in hand, smile sharp as broken glass. "Welcome to Riverside Meadows," she'd said, her eyes already scanning their property like a general surveying a battlefield. "I'm Karen Westfield, HOA president. I like to personally greet all our new residents and ensure they understand our community standards." Sarah had invited her in for coffee, eager to make a good impression. Karen had spent 20 minutes pointing out violations they hadn't even committed yet. The flower pots on the porch were technically not the approved terracotta color, their welcome mat exceeded the acceptable size by 2 inches, and the decorative flag Sarah had hung by the door would need to come down immediately as it wasn't on the pre-approved list. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Karen had said, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. "I'm trying to protect all our property values. When one house looks substandard, it affects everyone. You understand, don't you?" Tom had bristled at the word substandard, but Sarah had touched his arm, keeping the peace. They'd removed the flag, bought new flower pots, and ordered a smaller welcome mat. It seemed easier than fighting, and they were new here. They wanted to fit in. But Karen's visits became more frequent. She'd appear at their door with printed violations, photographed evidence, and citations that required written responses. Their grass was 1/4 inch too long on a Tuesday in September. They brought their trash cans in 45 minutes past the mandated time. Emma had left her bike on the front lawn overnight, which violated the no recreational equipment visible from street clause. Each violation came with a fine $50, $75, $100. Each fine came with Karen's sympathetic smile and her rehearsed line, "I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. It's my duty to the community." Other neighbors began sharing their own Karen stories in hushed voices at block parties. The Johnsons had been fined $500 for planting roses instead of the HOA-approved pansies. The Patels had received a citation because their garage door was open for more than 2 consecutive hours on a Saturday. Mrs. Rodriguez had been threatened with a lien on her house because her mailbox post needed repainting. "She's always been intense about the rules," Mrs. Johnson had confided to Sarah one October afternoon, "but she's gotten worse over the past year. Ever since her divorce finalized, I think the HOA is the only thing she has left, and she's turned it into her personal fiefdom." Sarah had noticed something else, too. Karen seemed particularly fixated on families with children. She'd filed noise complaints about the Patel twins playing basketball in their driveway. She'd tried to ban chalk drawings on sidewalks, claiming they defaced community property. She'd even suggested implementing quiet hours between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m., which would have effectively banned kids from playing outside after school. What did children ever do to her? Tom had muttered after their 6th citation, "in as many weeks." Sarah had known then. None of them had. They couldn't have imagined that Karen's obsession with control, her fixation on rules, her particular targeting of families, all of it was building towards something far darker than petty harassment. The signs had been there, glaring in retrospect, but in those early months, the Mitchells had done what most people do when faced with unreasonable authority. They'd tried to comply, tried to stay under the radar, tried to believe that if they just followed the rules closely enough, they'd be left alone. They'd been so terribly, dangerously wrong. November arrived with the kind of cold that Minnesota residents knew meant winter wasn't coming. It had already settled in for the long haul. The first snow fell on the morning of November 3rd, transforming Riverside Meadows into a picture-perfect postcard. Emma had pressed her nose against the window before school, already planning the snowman she'd build that afternoon. For the Mitchell family, November also brought something else: Christmas anticipation. Emma had been counting down the days since Halloween ended, her advent calendar already assembled, her Christmas list revised daily. Sarah had always been one of those people who loved the entire holiday season, the decorating, the baking, the traditions they were building as a family. She'd grown up in a home where Thanksgiving weekend meant transforming the house into a winter wonderland, and she'd wanted to share that magic with Emma. The Friday after Thanksgiving, Sarah and Emma had spent the afternoon in the garage, sorting through boxes of decorations. They'd found the wreath Sarah's grandmother had made, the string lights Tom insisted on hanging even though he complained about it every year, and Emma's favorite, an inflatable snowman that stood 6 feet tall and waved mechanically when plugged in. "Can we put him in the front yard?" Emma had begged, hugging the deflated snowman to her chest. "Please, Mom. He makes everyone smile when they drive by." Sarah had hesitated. According to the HOA guidelines, holiday decorations couldn't be displayed until December 1st. But it was only 3 days away, and surely no one would care about a cheerful snowman bringing joy to the neighborhood. Besides, half the houses on their street already had wreaths on their doors or lights strung along their gutters. All right, Sarah had agreed, watching Emma's face light up brighter than any Christmas bulb. But if Mrs. Westfield says something, we'll have to take it down early. Deal. Deal. They'd set up the snowman right next to the driveway, securing him with stakes so the wind wouldn't carry him away. When they'd plugged him in, his friendly face had illuminated, one arm waving in perpetual greeting. Emma had clapped her hands, and even Tom had admitted it looked pretty good. The citation arrived in their mailbox the next morning. Sarah had stared at it in disbelief. The violation was for premature holiday decoration display, with a fine of $200 and a demand that the decoration be removed within 24 hours. There was a photograph attached, their snowman, time-stamped at 6:47 a.m., clearly taken by someone who'd been watching their house specifically. She photographed it before sunrise, Tom had said, his jaw tight as he read over Sarah's shoulder. She was literally waiting to catch us, but it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made Sarah's blood run cold. Rules exist for a reason. Those who can't follow simple guidelines shouldn't be surprised when consequences escalate. KW. Consequences escalate. The phrase had sent an inexplicable chill down Sarah's spine, but she'd shaken it off. It was just Karen being Karen. Dramatic, power-hungry, but ultimately harmless. They'd taken down the snowman, paid the fine, and marked their calendar to wait until December 1st for any further decorating. The harassment intensified. After that, Karen began parking her car at the end of their driveway, idling there for minutes at a time, watching their house. She filed noise complaints when Emma played in the backyard, claiming the child's laughter violated reasonable sound ordinances. She measured their grass with a ruler, showing up at their door with evidence that it was 3/8 of an inch too long in one corner of the yard. Most disturbing were the encounters Emma herself had begun reporting. Karen had approached her at the bus stop, asking questions about when her parents were home, whether they left her alone, what she did after school. She'd followed Emma home one afternoon, walking slowly behind her for 3 blocks, never saying a word but maintaining a constant, unnerving presence. "She scares me, Mommy," Emma had whispered one night at bedtime. "She looks at me like she's angry, but I didn't do anything wrong." Sarah had reported it to the HOA board, only to discover that Karen had stacked the board with her supporters, people who'd either been intimidated into compliance or who genuinely believed her authoritarian approach was maintaining standards. The complaint went nowhere. They'd even contacted the police about the stalking behavior, but without an explicit threat, there was little law enforcement could do. "Maybe we should just move," Sarah had suggested to Tom one particularly exhausting evening in late November. "Is it really worth it to stay here?" But moving wasn't simple. They'd sunk their savings into the down payment. The market had shifted since they'd bought, and selling now would mean taking a significant loss. More than that, Tom's job was only 10 minutes away, Emma loved her school, and they'd finally started building friendships with neighbors who were equally frustrated with Karen's tyranny. "We can't let one person drive us out of our home," Tom had said firmly. "She's a bully, and bullies only win when people run away." They decided to stick it out, to document everything, to build a case for Karen's removal at the next HOA election. Other neighbors were on board, too. A coalition was forming, people who were tired of living under constant surveillance and harassment. What they didn't know was that Karen had been escalating in ways they couldn't see. She'd been researching them online, learning their schedules, noting when they came and went. She'd been particularly interested in the nights they left Emma with Mrs. Rodriguez, those rare occasions when they had dinner plans or date nights. She'd been planning something, waiting for the perfect opportunity. And in early December, when Tom's company announced their annual holiday dinner, a mandatory event for management personnel 2 hours away, Karen had finally seen her chance. December 14th dawned gray and bitterly cold, the kind of morning where your breath froze in the air and exposed skin burned within seconds. The weatherman's voice on the radio was almost apologetic as he announced the forecast. Temperatures would plummet to -14 degrees by midnight, with wind chills pushing toward -30. A dangerous cold warning had been issued. Residents were urged to stay indoors, check on elderly neighbors, and bring pets inside. Sarah had been tempted to cancel their plans, But Tom had reminded her how important this dinner was. His company had just promoted him to regional manager, and the dinner was partly in his honor. His boss had explicitly said spouses were expected to attend. After everything they'd been through in the past few months, the stress of the move, the constant HOA harassment, the financial strain, they needed this. They needed one normal evening to remember they were more than just embattled homeowners or worried parents. They were still Tom and Sarah, partners who deserved to celebrate their accomplishments together. Mrs. Rodriguez had been delighted to watch Emma. "You two go and have a wonderful time," she'd insisted when Sarah called. "Emma and I will make cookies and watch movies. We always have so much fun together." Sarah had packed Emma's overnight bag carefully, pajamas, her favorite stuffed elephant, toothbrush, the nightlight she needed to sleep comfortably in unfamiliar places. Emma had been excited about the sleepover, already planning which cookies they'd bake first. Chocolate chip, she declared as Sarah had helped her into her winter coat that afternoon. With extra chocolate chips, and maybe some for Santa too, even though it's not Christmas yet. They'd walked Emma to Mrs. Rodriguez's house at 4:30 p.m., while the sky was still holding onto the last weak rays of afternoon light. The elderly woman had welcomed Emma with her usual warmth, already wearing an apron dusted with flour. "We'll have a wonderful evening," Mrs. Rodriguez had promised, squeezing Sarah's hand. "Don't you worry about a thing. You two enjoy yourselves." Sarah had kissed Emma's forehead, breathing in the strawberry scent of her daughter's shampoo. "Be good for Mrs. Rodriguez, sweetheart. We'll be back late, but we'll see you first thing tomorrow morning." "I'll be good, Mama. Promise." Those had been the last normal moments of their lives. What Sarah and Tom didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Karen Westfield had been watching. She'd seen them walk Emma to Mrs. Rodriguez's house. She'd noted the overnight bag, the hugs that lasted a little longer than usual, the way Tom had checked his watch, clearly conscious of their schedule. She'd been waiting for this. At 6:15 p.m., Karen had knocked on Mrs. Rodriguez's door. She'd been all smiles and false concern, holding a clipboard that lent her an air of official authority. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she'd said when Mrs. Rodriguez answered, "but there's been an issue at the Mitchell house. A pipe might be frozen, and since they're out of town, I have their spare key to check on things. I was wondering if Emma might come with me. She could show me which bathroom has been having problems, and I know Sarah has been so worried about the pipes in this cold weather." Mrs. Rodriguez had hesitated. Something about Karen's smile hadn't seemed quite right, but the woman was the HOA president, and she did have what looked like an official clipboard. More importantly, if there really was a pipe about to burst at the Mitchell house, it would be a disaster. "Well, I suppose if it's an emergency..." Mrs. Rodriguez had started. "Oh, it won't take more than 20 minutes, Karen had assured her. "I just need Emma to show me which bathroom, and then I'll bring her right back. I promise." Emma had been less enthusiastic, remembering her mother's warnings about going anywhere with Karen. But Mrs. Rodriguez had been there, and grown-ups were saying it was okay, and maybe if she helped fix something at her house, her parents would be proud of her. They'd walked the 3 houses down to the Mitchell home in the gathering darkness. The temperature had already dropped to -7 degrees, the wind making it feel even colder. Emma had been wrapped in her warmest coat, but she'd still shivered as they'd crossed the frozen lawns. Karen had indeed had a key. She'd had copies made months ago during one of her inspections, though no one had authorized this. She'd let them into the house, leading Emma through the warm, familiar rooms toward the back door. "Actually, Emma," Karen had said, her voice changing in a way that made the little girl's instincts scream warning, "I need to check something in the shed first. You know where your parents keep the tools, don't you?" Emma had nodded uncertainly. She wasn't supposed to go in the shed alone. Her parents had rules about that. But this was different, wasn't it? Mrs. Westfield was an adult, and they were just checking on things. The backyard had been dark, illuminated only by the motion sensor light that clicked on as they'd approached the shed. Karen had opened it, flicking on the single bulb that hung from the ceiling. "Go on inside," she'd urged. "Just show me where the pipe wrench is. I think I see the problem already." Emma had stepped into the shed. confused because there weren't any pipes in here, just tools and lawn equipment and the smell of grass and gasoline. She turned to ask Mrs. Westfield what she needed to find, and the door had slammed shut. The lock had clicked into place, and Emma Mitchell's nightmare had begun. The first thing Emma had felt was confusion. The shed had plunged into complete darkness when the door slammed shut. The light switch was on the outside, and the single bulb had been turned off immediately. Emma had stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. This had to be a mistake. Mrs. Westfield wouldn't really lock her in here. She would open the door any second, laughing, saying it was an accident, saying she was sorry. Mrs. Westfield? Emma had called, her voice small in the darkness. The door closed. Can you open it, please? Silence. Mrs. Westfield? I'm scared of the dark. Please open the door. Still nothing. Emma had felt her way to the door, her small hands fumbling for a handle that didn't exist on the inside. She pushed against it, testing, then pushed harder. The door didn't budge. She'd heard something then, footsteps crunching on frozen grass, moving away from the shed, getting fainter. Don't leave me here. Emma had screamed, panic rising in her throat. Please, I want my mommy. But the footsteps had continued fading until there was nothing but silence and cold and darkness, so complete it felt like being swallowed. Emma had pounded on the door with both fists, screaming until her throat was raw. She kicked at it, thrown her small body against it, begged and pleaded and cried. The shed was well built. Her father had been proud of that, with thick walls and a solid door that didn't give even a millimeter under her desperate assault. When her voice had given out and her hands hurt too much to keep hitting the door, Emma had sunk to the cold concrete floor and wrapped her arms around herself. She tried to think clearly through her terror. Her parents always said to think clearly in an emergency. What would they want her to do? She'd felt around in the darkness, hoping to find something, anything useful. Her fingers had encountered the lawn mower, sharp-edged tools that scared her in the dark, bags of fertilizer, stacks of flower pots. There was no phone in here, no blanket, no way to call for help. The single window was high up and covered with thick frost, barely letting in any light from the distant street lamps. The cold had started to seep through her coat within the first 10 minutes. Emma had been dressed for a quick walk between heated houses, not for sitting stationary in a building with no insulation in negative 14-degree weather. The shed's thin walls might as well have been made of paper against that kind of cold. The concrete floor beneath her sucked the heat from her body like a vampire draining blood. She tried to stay active, jumping up and down, moving around in the darkness, anything to keep warm. But the shed was only 8 feet by 8 feet and filled with equipment. She barked her shins on the lawn mower, nearly impaled herself on a rake, stumbled over bags of salt meant for icy sidewalks. Each injury had made her cry harder, and crying made the cold worse because her tears froze on her cheeks. Time had become strange in the darkness. Emma hadn't known if she'd been in the shed for minutes or hours. Her body had started doing strange things, shivering so hard her teeth chattered, then stopping suddenly, which had scared her even more, because she'd felt warmer when she stopped shivering, and some instinct told her that warmth was a lie. She'd called for help until her voice was gone completely. She'd screamed for her parents, for Mrs. Rodriguez, for any of the neighbors. But the shed was in the backyard, hidden behind the privacy fence they'd been so excited about. The wind had picked up too, howling around the corners of houses, covering any sound she might have made. Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't checked on Emma immediately. She'd trusted Karen to bring the girl back as promised, and when 20 minutes had stretched to 30, then 45, she'd assumed they were still dealing with the pipe emergency. The elderly woman had been in her warm kitchen, preparing hot chocolate for Emma's return, completely unaware that 3 doors down, a child was freezing to death in the dark. Karen, meanwhile, had returned to her own home. She'd poured herself a glass of wine and sat in her living room, staring at the phone on her coffee table. She'd convinced herself she was teaching the Mitchells a lesson, nothing more. They'd learn what it meant to respect the rules, to respect her authority. She'd let Emma out in an hour or so, Once the child was sufficiently scared, once the family understood that there were consequences for defiance. But the wine had kept flowing, and the clock had kept ticking, and somewhere in Karen's fractured reasoning, an hour had seemed too soon. The child needed to really learn, really understand, really feel the consequences of her parents' disrespect. Back in the shed, Emma had curled into the smallest ball she could manage, trying to conserve body heat like she'd seen animals do in nature documentaries. Her fingers had gone numb first, then her toes. She'd tucked her hands into her armpits, pulled her knees to her chest, tried to make herself invisible to the cold. She'd thought about her parents, wondering when they'd realize something was wrong. She'd thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's chocolate chip cookies, still unmade in a kitchen that seemed impossibly far away. She'd thought about her stuffed elephant, waiting for her in the overnight bag she'd never unpacked. Most of all, as the cold had burrowed deeper into her small body and her thoughts had started to become fuzzy and strange, Emma had thought about how this couldn't really be happening. Grown-ups didn't do things like this. This had to be a nightmare, and any moment she'd wake up in her warm bed, safe and sound, and her mother would come in to tell her it was all just a bad dream. But she hadn't woken up. The nightmare had been real, and it had only been getting worse. At 9:47 p.m., Mrs. Rodriguez had finally felt the full weight of her terrible mistake. Karen still hadn't returned with Emma, and Mrs. Rodriguez's calls to the Mitchell house had gone unanswered. She'd walked the 3 houses down in the brutal cold, knocking on the door, peering through windows into dark rooms. No one was there. No emergency pipe repair was happening. She'd tried Karen's house next, but the HOA president hadn't answered her door despite the lights being on inside. Growing panic had driven Mrs. Rodriguez to do something she'd never done before. She'd called 911. "I think a child might be missing," she'd told the operator, her voice shaking. "I let her go with someone, and they haven't brought her back. Something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong." Officer Lisa Chun had responded to the call with her partner, expecting a misunderstanding, a child at a friend's house, a miscommunication about pickup times, the usual dramas of suburban parenting. But Mrs. Rodriguez's distress had been palpable, and the temperature outside had been life-threatening. They'd taken it seriously. "Tell me exactly what happened," Officer Chin had said, notebook out, attention focused. Mrs. Rodriguez had explained about Karen's visit, the supposed pipe emergency, the promise to return Emma within 20 minutes. But that was over 3 hours ago. She'd finished, tears streaming down her weathered face. "And the parents are 2 hours away at a dinner. I've been calling them, but there's no answer. I think their phones might be off for the event." Officer Chun and her partner had immediately gone to the Mitchell house, walking the perimeter with flashlights. The back gate had been unlocked, unusual for a December night. As they'd swept their lights across the backyard, Officer Chun had heard something that made her blood freeze. A small, weak sound, almost like a kitten mewing. "Did you hear that?" she'd asked her partner. They'd fallen silent, listening. There it was again. So faint they'd almost missed it. It was coming from the shed. "Is someone in there?" Officer Chun had called, approaching the structure. "Can you hear me?" The sound had become slightly louder. A child's voice, barely there. "Help!" The shed door had been secured with a padlock. A padlock on a shed in a family home with an 8-year-old daughter. Officer Chun had radioed for bolt cutters while her partner had tried to keep the child conscious and talking. "We're going to get you out, sweetheart. Just stay awake for us. Can you tell me your name?" "Emma." The voice had been thin as paper. "Cold." The bolt cutters had arrived within 8 minutes, but those had been the longest 8 minutes of Officer Chen's career. When they'd finally snapped the lock and pulled open the door, the sight that had greeted them would haunt their dreams for years to come. Emma had been curled in the fetal position on the concrete floor, her lips blue, her skin pale as death. Her eyes had been open but unfocused, and she hadn't been shivering anymore, a terrifying sign that meant her body was shutting down. The temperature inside the shed had been measured at -8 degrees Fahrenheit. "Get an ambulance here now." Officer Chun had shouted into her radio, already scooping Emma's tiny, frozen body into her arms. "We have a child with severe hypothermia. This is critical." They'd carried Emma into the house, cranking up the heat, wrapping her in every blanket they could find. The ambulance had arrived within 6 minutes, and the paramedics had worked with practiced efficiency, hooking Emma up to monitors, checking her core temperature, radiating her with warming blankets. Core temp is 86 degrees. One paramedic had announced grimly, "That's severe hypothermia. We need to transport immediately." It was then that Officer Chun had made the call that would wake Sarah and Tom Mitchell from their dinner, destroying their evening and changing their lives forever. While Emma was being rushed to the hospital, Officer Chen's partner had been conducting interviews. Mrs. Rodriguez had been beside herself with guilt, explaining again about Karen's visit, the clipboard, the official-seeming demeanor. Other neighbors had gathered, drawn by the emergency lights, and they'd had plenty to say about Karen Westfield. "She's been completely unhinged lately," one neighbor had confided. "I saw her watching their house for hours sometimes. She was obsessed with that family." At 11:52 p.m., officers had knocked on Karen Westfield's door with enough force to make it clear that not answering wasn't an option. When she'd finally opened it, wine glass still in hand, they'd found her surprisingly calm. "I don't know what this is about," she'd said, "but I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. We found Emma Mitchell locked in her family's shed with severe hypothermia," Officer Chin had stated, watching Karen's face carefully. "Multiple witnesses saw you take her from Mrs. Rodriguez's house at 6:15 p.m. You told Mrs. Rodriguez you had the Mitchells' permission and that there was a pipe emergency. That was a lie." For just a moment, something had flickered across Karen's face. Not guilt exactly, but a cold calculation, a desperate weighing of options. Then she'd settled on indignation. "I was teaching her parents a lesson," she'd said, as if this explained everything. "They needed to understand that rules have consequences. I was going to let her out soon. This is all being blown completely out of proportion." Officer Chun had heard a lot of justifications in her career, but this had been among the most chilling. "Ma'am, you locked an 8-year-old child in a freezing shed during a dangerous cold warning. She nearly died. You're under arrest for child endangerment, kidnapping, and reckless conduct." The handcuffs had clicked shut around Karen's wrists as the weight of what she'd done had finally begun to register on her face. But by then, it was far too late for remorse to matter. Sarah and Tom had driven those 2 hours in a blind panic that would forever remain a blur of terror and tears. They'd arrived at St. Mary's Hospital to find Emma in a pediatric intensive care room, surrounded by warming equipment and monitors, looking impossibly small in the hospital bed. "She's stable," the doctor had told them, and those 2 words had been the only thing keeping Sarah from collapsing entirely. "Her core temperature is back up to 95 degrees. We caught it in time. She's going to recover physically, but—" The doctor had paused, choosing words carefully. "This kind of trauma, especially at her age, can have lasting psychological effects. She's going to need support." Emma had been in the hospital for 3 days. The hypothermia had caused some tissue damage to her fingers and toes. Minor enough that full recovery was expected, but significant enough to serve as permanent reminders of that night. The psychological damage was harder to quantify, but impossible to miss. Emma had woken screaming from nightmares, terrified of the dark, refusing to sleep unless both parents were in the room. The media attention had been immediate and intense. A story about an HOA president locking a child in a freezing shed during sub-zero temperatures wasn't just local news, it had gone national, then viral. The cable news channels had run segments. Social media had exploded with outrage. Riverside Meadows, once a quiet suburban enclave, had found itself at the center of a firestorm about HOA's power and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority. Karen Westfield had been charged with child endangerment, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and reckless conduct. The prosecution had argued for the maximum sentence, presenting evidence of Karen's months-long campaign of harassment, her obsessive documentation of the Mitchells' activities, and witness testimonies about her increasingly unstable behavior. The trial had revealed the full extent of Karen's dysfunction. A forensic psychologist had testified that Karen had been experiencing a breakdown following her divorce, fixating on control of the HOA as a replacement for the life she'd lost. The Mitchells, with their happy family and their minor rule infractions, had become the focal point of her rage, a target for all her frustration and powerlessness. She convinced herself she was the victim, the psychologist had explained. In her mind, enforcing the rules, teaching lessons, maintaining control, these weren't acts of aggression, but of self-defense against a world that wasn't respecting her authority. The jury had taken less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. Karen had been sentenced to 4 years in prison, with an additional 3 years of supervised probation upon release. The judge's words during sentencing had been scathing. "You took a position of minor authority in a homeowners association and twisted it into a weapon. You terrorized your neighbors, targeted a family with a young child, and ultimately committed an act so reckless, so cruel, that this child could have died. The only reason we're not calling this attempted murder is because I don't believe you fully comprehended the consequences of your actions. But ignorance is not innocence, and you will be held accountable." The civil lawsuit had been even more devastating for Karen. The Mitchells had sued for medical expenses, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The jury had awarded them $2.3 million. Karen's assets had been seized, her house sold, her retirement accounts emptied. She'd lost everything, her home, her savings, her reputation, her freedom. But money and justice, Sarah had discovered, couldn't erase the trauma. Emma had been in therapy twice a week. For months, she'd gradually regained some of her confidence, but she was changed. She no longer ran to answer the door when someone knocked. She insisted on night lights in every room. She asked questions that broke her parents' hearts. Why did Mrs. Westfield hate me? Was I bad? Did I do something wrong? The answer, of course, was that Emma had done nothing wrong. She'd been the collateral damage in an adult's psychological breakdown, a victim of power unchecked by empathy or reason. The HOA itself had been dissolved by unanimous vote of the remaining board members. The neighborhood had rallied around the Mitchell family, offering support, meals, and most importantly, a commitment to ensure nothing like this could ever happen again. Mrs. Rodriguez, consumed by guilt despite everyone's assurances that she'd been manipulated, had become an even more devoted presence in Emma's life, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. 6 months after that terrible night, on a warm June evening, Sarah had found Emma in the backyard. The shed had been torn down weeks after the incident, replaced with a flower garden that Emma had helped design. She'd wanted something beautiful where something terrible had happened. "Mom," Emma had said, looking up from the daisies she'd been watering, "do you think Mrs. Westfield will ever understand how much she hurt me?" Sarah had knelt beside her daughter, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people get so caught up in being right, in having control, that they stop seeing other people as human beings. They forget that their actions have real consequences for real people." Emma had nodded slowly, thinking. "I hope she learns," she'd said finally. "I hope wherever she is, she's learning to be kinder." The compassion in her daughter's voice had made Sarah cry, not tears of sadness, but of pride. Despite everything Karen had done, despite the trauma and the fear and the pain, Emma was still capable of hoping for another person's redemption. Karen had tried to break her, but Emma's essential sweetness, her fundamental goodness, had survived. The scars remained, physical, psychological, familial. The Mitchells would carry this experience with them forever. But they were healing. They were moving forward. And in their healing, in their determination to build something better from the ashes of that nightmare, there was a kind of victory that no court verdict could match. They'd survived. They'd stayed together. And slowly, painfully, they were learning to feel safe in their own home again. What does it take for power to corrupt so completely that someone could lock a child in a freezing shed and convince themselves they were doing the right thing? Karen Westfield wasn't a monster from birth. She was a neighbor, a community member, someone who likely started with good intentions about maintaining property values. But somewhere along the way, Rules became more important than people. Authority became more precious than compassion. Control became an obsession that justified the unjustifiable. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we create and the power we grant to those who promise to protect our interests. HOAs aren't inherently evil, but they're structures that concentrate authority with minimal oversight. When someone like Karen, someone struggling, wounded, looking for meaning and control, gets that authority, tragedy becomes not just possible but probable. We live in a world full of Karens in various forms. People who hide cruelty behind rule enforcement. People who mistake authority for righteousness. People who forget that behind every infraction, every violation, every problem to be solved, there's a human being who deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with basic dignity. Emma Mitchell almost died because adults around her, good adults, caring adults, assumed that official-seeming authority must be legitimate. Mrs. Rodriguez trusted Karen because she held a title and carried a clipboard. The HOA board enabled her because they believed order mattered more than investigating complaints. Neighbors stayed silent about her escalating behavior because confrontation felt harder than compliance. How many other Emmas are out there right now? How many children, elderly people, vulnerable individuals are suffering under petty tyrants who've convinced themselves that their power justifies their cruelty? How many communities are enabling abuse by prioritizing rules over relationships, authority over accountability? This story isn't just entertainment. It's a warning and a call to action. Here's what you need to do. 1. Examine the power structures around you. Whether it's an HOA, a school board, a workplace hierarchy, or a community organization, who has authority over you and your family? What oversight exists? What happens when someone abuses that authority? If you can't answer these questions, find out. 2. Don't stay silent. If you see someone being harassed, targeted, or treated unfairly by those in authority, speak up. The neighbors who whispered about Karen's behavior, but never formally challenged her, share some responsibility for what happened. Your voice matters. Your willingness to stand up for others matters. 3. Trust your instincts. Mrs. Rodriguez had misgivings about Karen, but overrode them because of perceived authority. If something feels wrong, investigate. Ask questions. Protect the vulnerable, especially children, even if it means challenging someone who claims to be in charge. 4. Advocate for change. Push for accountability in community organizations. Demand term limits, oversight boards, transparent complaint procedures. Make sure no one person can wield unchecked authority over others' lives. 5. Share the story. Not for clicks or likes, but because people need to understand how easily power corrupts and how devastating the consequences can be. Every person who reads this and changes their approach to authority, oversight, or standing up for others is a potential Emma saved from a freezing shed. 6. Check on your neighbors. Real communities look out for each other. They notice when someone is being targeted. They intervene when they see harm happening. Be that neighbor. Be that friend. Be that person who gives a damn about others, even when it's inconvenient. Emma Mitchell survived, but her childhood innocence didn't. Her absolute trust in adults didn't. Her sense of safety in her own home didn't. Those things died in that shed on a night cold enough to kill, and no amount of justice or healing will bring them fully back. We can't undo what happened to Emma, but we can make sure it doesn't happen to the next child, the next family, the next victim of someone who's forgotten that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. The question isn't whether you care about what happened to Emma Mitchell. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to examine the power structures in your own community? Are you going to speak up the next time you see someone being harassed by petty authority? Are you going to be the person who says, this isn't right when everyone else is staying silent? Emma is healing. Her family is rebuilding. But somewhere right now, another Karen is harassing another family, and another vulnerable person is hoping someone will notice, someone will care, someone will intervene. That someone needs to be you. Share the story. Talk about it with your neighbors, your HOA board, your community leaders. Demand accountability. Build relationships that prioritize people over rules. Create communities where cruelty can't hide behind clipboards and bylaws. Emma deserves a world where what happened to her is impossible. Every child deserves that world, and we're the only ones who can build it. What will you do today to make sure no child ever has to endure what Emma Mitchell endured? The answer to that question might just save a life.